you're not the good guy pretending to be a bad guy. Maybe you're the bad guy pretending to be the good guy.
You here to take Nan O'Connor?
This judiciary finds that one right does not make up for a lifetime worth of wrongs.
The year was 8AFAF, or as you may know it, 2009. It had been a rough decade so far for the United States, nay, the world. Not only did the PS3 cost like $700 and have no games, but the ripples sent forth from that fateful day in 2001 were still rippling forth, impacting the whole world. It was a day like any other day. June 22nd, 2001, the release of the first Fast and Furious movie, the most important day of that year. Well, except for... Despite the first film being hugely successful and becoming a smash hit amongst the young folks, the studio was unable to convince anyone else to come back for the sequel. Except Paul Walker, because they had him contractually handcuffed to a Nissan Skyline GTR.
Oh, how can we get these people to agree to do another one of these movies, Stimpy?
Universal asked while sitting on a massive pile of money generated by the first movie. The eventual sequel, Too Fast, Too Furious, did alright, but not nearly as well as the first, and after it came out, Paul Walker was free to pursue his true passion, being an 8 Below. And just like that, they had lost 100% of the original cast. They essentially had no choice but to make a spin-off starring Roman. They had no choice but to pay the actors more. Just kidding! They did what any cheap studio with a hot IP would do. Direct-to-DVD sequel with no returning cast members! Luckily for them though, they fucked up and accidentally hired a competent writer and a genius director to make the third movie, so it ended up in theaters anyway and did fairly well too. But it wasn't good enough for those bastards at Universal. While many people such as myself and renowned director Christopher Nolan loved Tokyo Drift,
I'm sort of original recipe. I mean, the Fast and Furious, the Rob Cohen original. But I've got a very soft spot for Tokyo Drift, actually.
at the time of release, people weren't that into it. You see, it different bad. Rare stuff that I know. Despite the studio's best efforts to quell the rising tide of anger around the world from audiences who wanted more epic white boy car stuff, it had become obvious that the Fast and the Furious needed to get back to basics. It was time to finally do a direct sequel to the first movie. We're gonna get Paul Dubsky back. We're gonna get Michelle Rodriguez back. Get Jordana Brewster back. And by God, we're gonna get Vin Diesel back. Getting V Dizzy to return was going to be tough, believe it or not. At the time, Vincent Diesel didn't often do sequels. If he didn't like the script, he walked. That's the same reason he wasn't in Triple X2 State of the Union. You know, because that one sucks. I guess the script for The Pacifier must have been, like, incredible. But after he sat down with the director and the writer and they discussed the major themes of the movie and what it all meant, and he demanded the studio gave him a fuck ton of money and made him a producer and let him write and direct a 20-minute short film where Michelle Rodriguez makes out with him for a long time, he was all in and back on board, semicolon, close parentheses. But what about Ludacris and Tyrese?
Ludacris is in it?
Ludacris and Tyrese. I'm just kidding, you two are my favorite little guys in the whole wide world, and it's so f***ed up that you aren't here. We're taking Han with us, though. Yeah, I know Han died in the last movie, but it's best to learn now that a character dying in these movies has nothing to do with them being alive or not. And no, Hector isn't here either. Hector Sells dropped some F's in the chat. And when they said it was time to go back, they really meant it was time to go back. They called it Fast and Furious. Drop the the. It's so frustratingly close to the title of the first movie, which makes talking about it confusing on a conversational level. If you say Fast and Furious, people are probably going to think you mean the entire franchise, or the first one, or the 1927 silent film, or the 1939 Bubsby Berkeley film, or the 1954 drama, not, you know, the fourth sequel. So to make things less confusing, I'll be calling this movie Forced and Furious, so we all know which one I'm talking about. Japan had the right idea, calling this movie Wild Speed Max. All the Japanese names for this series are actually, like, way better. Hobbs and Shaw is called Super Combo! That's so good. And despite the lukewarm reception to Tokyo Drift at the time, Universal still opted to go with Chris Morgan on the keys and Justin Lin on the director's chair for Fast and Furious. They came up with a bold new strategy for the franchise going forward. Times had changed a lot since the first movie, and that had to be reflected in the new ones, and, well, for all intents and purposes, the Fast and the Furious is going to change forever. Fast and Furious picks up 5 years after the events of the first film and acts almost as if Too Fast, Too Furious had never even happened. Brian is not in Florida running a garage with Roman, he's back in LA, working for the FBI. They forgave him. It also seems that Tokyo Drift hasn't happened yet either, as Han is rolling with Mr. American Muscle himself, Dom, and Letty, and the guys who made the Los Bandoleros song. And god damn it, I forgot about the short film Los Bandoleros that takes place right before the beginning of this movie. Drop a comment if you even knew Los Bandoleros has been sitting on your Fast and Furious DVD for the last 14 years. Los Bandoleros is a prequel to the main movie that pretty much just explains why Dom and his gang are trying to steal the oil tankers at the beginning of the film, which I had honestly never thought about for even 1 second. Why are they stealing the tanker? So they can do stunts and big kaboom money? I don't give a fuck, I'm dumb. It follows Dom in the Dominican Republic vowing to steal some gasoline in order to help this impoverished village that he's been hiding out in. Han and Letty arrive to help, but for the most part the short is pretty inconsequential. It is nice to see that unlike the DVD players that were only stolen to fund wild playtime, they've graduated to at least kinda noble theft. Otherwise, after Letty returns, the movie just becomes her and Dom making out on a beach. Do you think they storyboarded this? I'm driving a car and I grab her butt while we're making out and I'm driving a... Los Bandoleros is an interesting little piece of Fast and Furious lore, it gives us some backstory on Han and Dom meeting in Mexico, and if you subscribe to the "This Han is the same Han from Better Luck Tomorrow" school of thought, which you should because he is, you can assume that they both fled to Mexico around the same time of 2001, after their respective shenanigans fell apart thanks to some idiot whose name started with a B. As for Letty, I never thought about it until now, but what happens to her after the botched heist in the original movie is never really explained. Thanks to Los Bandoleros, we know that she did go to Mexico, but Dom wasn't there anymore. She had to follow the smell of skanks to reach him again. But it's unclear how long that was and why she didn't go straight to Baja, Mexico like he did. It seems like Dom has been in the DR for a long time. He's a godfather to a bunch of kids and very close to people we will totally be seeing a lot of throughout the rest of the series. Los Bandoleros opens up with this rant from Tigo Leo in prison, where he talks about being a bandolero, or more so how bandoleros come to be. Los Bandoleros translates to the outlaws, and what Tigo is saying in this monologue is that there's this vicious cycle where the government creates these systems to keep people poor, desperate, and dependent on them. Things like outlawing a car that runs without gas to keep people buying expensive and harmful fuels. I looked into this part and I can't find anything about it. I think he's talking out of his ass. And essentially saying that there are these vicious systems in place that push people towards a life of crime so they can be arrested and provide free labor as a form of modern day slavery. Pretty damn based way to start a movie that will end with Vin Diesel groping Michelle Rodriguez. Anyway, back in Fast and Furious, Dom and his gang are back to their old ways, harassing truck drivers.
That's a nice-ass car! Ryan. I am so fucking mad right now. Are you?
Down here, gas is gold, Papa.
Why did you say that? But we're actually going to pause on the beginning heist sequence and come back to it a little bit later. All you gotta know is that the police are hot on their trail and the crew has to split up and Dom has to leave Letty so she'll be safe. So I guess the police only want him and none of his accomplices at it. I don't know the law in the Dominican Republic, that might be how it works. Until Dom learns that Letty returned to the United States and was murdered. Oh my god, Letty, no. No, Letty, oh my god, I can't believe it. I can't believe Letty's dead. Oh my god. Prompting him to return to Los Angeles seeking revenge and putting him on a collision course with his old friend Brian O'Connor, as they're both after the person responsible for her death, a mysterious Mexican drug trafficker and cartel leader named Arturo Braga. The FBI looks at Brian's 50% success rate for going undercover and don't factor in his prior relation to Letty that resulted in him letting a wanted criminal loose and then going on the run for like a year himself, and send him undercover again as a street racer to run drugs for the Braga's cartel.
Infiltrate the dealers, find the supply.
But Dom had the same idea, and he also goes undercover for himself to personally infiltrate the dealers, find the supplier. The idea of having Dom on a revenge quest came from the original Tokyo Drift pitch, which is going to be Dom investigating a murder in Tokyo while, like, also learning how to drift. I'm not saying we were robbed because, you know, I love Tokyo Drift, but we were sort of robbed. Like, was the pacifier really better than that script, Mr. Diesel? Like, are you sure? This movie continues the gaslighting from the first one, where Brian is still considered the only reason things fell apart.
We had a good thing, you stupid son of a bitch.
Dom is still mad at him, Mia is still mad at him, wherever Vince and Leon are, they're still mad at him. And Brian is still mad at himself. Despite everything, he just loves these people. It doesn't totally make sense, but that's the thing about love. When you feel it, and it doesn't matter what some sweaty dipshit who smells like deli chicken thinks. I mean, it's not that hard to understand. Brian had it all. A bad Latina girlfriend, he was friends with her brother, and they built cars that went fast. And he blew it. Anakin Skywalker was drawn to the dark side to save his wife. Brian O'Connor was drawn to the dark side for barbecue chicken. But this movie poses a similar question to Too Fast, Too Furious. Who are the real bad guys? Is it really black and white? Go back to the opening speech in Los Bandoleros, the government creating systematic oppression to farm slave labor from the lower class who inevitably turned to crime to provide for themselves and their families. When it was just DVD players, I'm not saying you need to feel bad for Panasonic or anything, but it was certainly a more selfish endeavor to steal them. The gas tanker, on the other hand, was to help a community. So is the theft still wrong? Are they really the bad guys here? In Too Fast, the FBI was willing to let Brian and Roman get killed if it meant they could have the glory of arresting the Miami Kingpin. Here, it's a very similar situation again. The FBI has sent in dozens of agents undercover in the Braga's cartel, and all have died after doing their first heroin shipment. Yet they just keep sending people in. When Dom and Brian escape the cartel with the heroin, Brian has to beg the FBI to let them use it as a bargaining chip to lure Braga out so they can arrest him in exchange for clearing Dom's record. But they refuse to wait for Brian's signal and botch the operation, pinning it all on him, despite it not being his fault. Once again, Brian has to work outside the law to get results and finally take down Braga, but the FBI goes back on their deal and doesn't wipe Dom's record. On one side, you have legal immorality, and on the other, illegal morality. Ever since we've known Brian, he's had this inner struggle with who he really is. A lawman or a lawless man. I think Brian has always seen himself as the good man, someone who wants to help and do the right thing, but the right thing has often also been the illegal thing. I think he initially joined the police to make a difference, but quickly realized it would be impossible within that framework of bureaucracy.
I know your intentions are good, but aren't the police a protective force that maintains the status quo for the wealthy elites? Don't you think we ought to attack the roots of social problems instead of jamming people into overcrowded prisons?
When Brian and Mia talk at the cafe, Mia says to him, "Are you the good guy pretending to be the bad guy? Or the bad guy pretending to be the good guy?" Pretending to be someone you're not, or more so identity, I would say, is the core theme of Forced and Furious. Every main character in this movie not only goes undercover, Brian, Dom, Letty, and Braga himself, but you could even argue that the movie is going undercover as the first movie by naming itself that. But not only do they go undercover, they are also forced to reckon with who they are underneath. Not so much Braga, but I mean, I guess at the end, Braga probably learns that underneath it all, he has a concussion. For the first time, Dom must come to terms with the consequences of his quarter-mile-at-a-time lifestyle, because Letty is dead. And she's never coming back either. Towards the end of the movie, Dom discovers that Brian actually sent Letty in as an undercover agent to infiltrate the dealers and find the suppliers in Braga's cartel, and she died as a result. He's fast to be furious at first until Brian tells him that she did it to clear his name. She did it for you, Dom! She did it for you! These days, with how memed up the family stuff in Fast and Furious movies are, it can be hard to remember that in the first movie, despite everything, all Dom actually cared about was himself. He selfishly pursued saccharine delights at the expense of his friends and family, and it's not until this moment right here that he finally realizes what a fool he's been. For those 10 seconds or less, nothing else mattered, because there's literally nothing else left if he continued living like this. I don't think Dom was a total piece of shit at the beginning when he left her. He clearly thought he was doing the right thing and protecting her by leaving. I think upon learning that she risked her life and died, died permanently forever just for him, just to have a chance to clear his name, he realized how selfish he'd always been. While he was running away, everyone else was trying to find solutions for him. What was he doing? Nothing. And I think ultimately Dom knew that the FBI wasn't going to hold up their end of the bargain. I think he knew that after this was all said and done, he was gonna go to prison. I think this was Dom's sacrifice and way of telling everyone that he's sorry and he's going to take responsibility. Brian and Mia have different ideas, but I want to finally come back to the gas heist at the start of the film. This film signals an identity change for the franchise as a whole. Before this, there was always action, don't get me wrong. Brian and Roman jumping the Camaro on the Verone's yacht is insane, and you can make the argument that the series went off the rails exactly in that moment, or hell, even the bridge jump at the beginning of Too Fast, but for the most part, between the first movie and Tokyo Drift, they'd been relatively grounded. Even after the yacht jump, it fucks up Brian and Roman quite a bit. I always enjoyed it. There was no airbags in the Camaros, so they get just destroyed. But this movie, Forced and Furious, I think is pretty undeniably the beginning of what many fans call the action bullshit age of the series. Some like to say 5 is when it went crazy, but I think it's this one. In the first movie, they get completely destroyed by one guy with a shotgun who's barely even aiming. In this one, they're jumping back and forth between cars, the gas tanker is exploding and Dom drifts under it. They're racing through collapsing tunnels, it's ridiculous. Dom gets shot and just doesn't care. And he has detective vision. It's not as crazy as it's ever going to get, we all know that, but in comparison to previous ones, it's nuts. It's still kinda grounded, you know, Brian gets banged up after Phoenix crashes into him, and Phoenix's death is probably the most brutal death yet featured in the entire franchise. Unless I'm just like dumb and forgetting one. So I'll admit, we haven't totally left reality yet, but we're pretty close. And I think now we need to talk about something that's been a very long time coming. The Fast and the Furious franchise has never been about street racing. I know that sounds crazy, but it's true. None of these movies totally focus on street racing as the main draw of the film. They all merely feature it. The first is an undercover cop movie that features scenes of street racing, but his goal is not to win races, make a name for himself or anything, it's to do his job as an undercover cop and the turmoil that puts him in. Too Fast is again about going undercover and taking down a criminal empire. There are street races in it, but his primary goal is not to win races and make a name for himself. And Tokyo Drift, while coming the closest to being a street racing movie, still isn't. Sean's motivation has more to do with learning to drift and dealing with Takashi, a gangster criminal. This one does, at the very least, actually culminate in a proper race and focus more on Sean establishing himself as a respected racer. However, that is far from the only thing going on, or even the main thing. It's mostly his conflict with Takashi and his relationship to his new friends. This may seem needlessly restrictive or pedantic or whatever, but I bring this up because people always act like it's so crazy that the series took this over-the-top action route instead of sticking to their roots, when in reality they actually are sticking to their roots. I mean, compare the first 3 Fast and Furious films with something that's actually about street racing, like Initial D. In Initial D, the stakes are extremely low. It's literally just a bunch of dudes who go to various mountains in Japan and race each other for fun. It's dramatized for the sake of making it entertaining, but the focus of the series is almost entirely on racing, racers, where they're going to race, their cars, their rivalries, etc. Go back to the very beginning of the Fast and the Furious and it's always been about sneaking around, doing spy shit, going undercover, criminal empires, action set pieces, and character drama. And yeah, cars are there too. I think what people really mean when they say focused on street racing is that the early series heavily featured import tuner cars. Even Dominic American Muscle Toretto himself drove an RX-7, and to a lot of people, particularly car guys, that's what the series was about, because they really liked seeing those cars. I think it's kind of like when you watch a Godzilla movie, you kind of just tune out all the parts that aren't a giant silly monster destroying the city. Yeah, I really give a shit about Millie Bobby Brown in this podcast. They're putting Godzilla and King Kong back on screen. I'll give you that they're definitely car culture movies, but calling these movies street racing movies is like calling Point Break a surfing movie. Like, yeah, they do surf in it, but it's not a surfing movie. It's an action movie about an undercover cop who joins a gang of adrenaline junkies who have been committing a series of robberies in Los Angeles, but he ends up developing a sort of respect for them and their charismatic leader. Hang on a second. But that all doesn't mean that Forced and Furious isn't still an identity change for the series. Much like how Dom and Brian must come to embrace the two sides of themselves that have always been at odds, Brian's heart of gold and his propensity for breaking the law, and Dom's renegade lifestyle and the love he has for his family. The Force in the Furious learns to embrace the franchise's love for car action and go all in with just doing crazy, ridiculous shit. Maybe it's not the deepest one of these films to ever come out, and if I'm being honest, it's probably my least favorite entry in the entire franchise at the moment. The filmmakers bet on combining the faces we love with action that makes us come, and they were right to, because this movie at the time of release made more money than any of the previous films had. They went from the lowest earning entry to the highest in just 3 years. Of course they were going to step on the gas. I'm not trying to say you're a hypocrite or haven't been paying attention to the franchise if you're upset with the direction the series took after the first 3. Those first 3 are my favorites too. But what I am saying is that the trajectory was pretty clearly more in the direction of action movies than these street racing sports dramas that so many fans act like the first 3 movies were. And if street racing movies are what you want, The Fast and the Furious was never the series for you anyway. Initial D was, One Gone Midnight was, a bunch of movies that look like total shit that are free to stream on Tubi was. But none of that is to say that from here on out, The Fast and the Furious is just dumb, stupid poop water movies that work best as background noise while you're eating a hot dog. There is still some substance here. I hope. At the end of the day, these movies have continued to be about characters. Complex characters doing complex things, and Han and Vin Diesel, Brian, and shit, man.
Let's get some pussy tonight.